It was a night like any other until it wasn't. There are certain sounds that aren't meant to be heard with the ears. They move underneath the silence like fingers beneath skin, shifting, pulsing, waiting to be noticed. On the night of July 14th in the sleepy town of Elridge, something began to stir, not loudly, not violently, but with the soft insistence of rot beneath floorboards, of something breathing behind a locked door, of forgotten things waking up in the dark. The town had always seemed harmless on the surface. One grocery store, one blinking traffic light, one bar that served the same whiskey to the same old men every Friday night. Summers passed slowly, each night cooling into a still, breathless silence after sundown. Porch lights hummed, screen doors creaked, and the air carried the weight of time. People trusted the quiet. They trusted it too much. Angela Sullivan stood alone behind the counter of the Quick Fool station on Route 9. The clock read 11:36 p.m., and her shift had gone on longer than usual. Outside, the streetlights buzzed with the monotonous flicker of dying bulbs, casting long, broken shadows across the pavement. She poured herself a stale cup of coffee, the glass of the coffee pot steaming slightly as the temperature dropped strangely cold for mid-July. That's when it happened. A vibration, not loud but low, deeper than bass, more primal than thunder. It passed through her feet first, through the soles of her shoes. It rose slowly through the tiles, through her knees, through her rib cage, until her teeth began to click softly together like tiny bones knocking in a prayer. She froze, looked around. The freezer door at the back of the store shivered lightly, its handle rattling. Nothing else moved. No wind. No passing cars. Just that low hum, invisible and suffocating, as if the air itself had become sentient and didn't want to be breathed. Her eyes drifted toward the mirror behind the chip racks. Small, round, security-grade glass. For a moment, she thought it was fogging over, but then she noticed her reflection wasn't following her. It stood still while she moved, its head tilted a moment too late. And when it smiled, Angela felt something pull inside her chest, like her lungs had turned to paper. She blinked. The reflection caught up. But it was enough. 2 miles across town, Harold Weaver sat on the back porch of his one-story home, a thick wool blanket around his shoulders and an untouched cigar between his fingers. The night was unnaturally still, and the moon looked bruised, its usual glow replaced with a dull, orange hue that gave the sky a sickly look. He didn't notice the vines near his garden begin to move at first, but when they started slithering, not swaying, something inside him shifted. The kind of feeling that crawls up your spine when you realize you're being watched by something you can't see. The vines were trembling, though the air was dead. The wooden fence creaked, not from weight, but from pressure, like it was being pushed from the other side. Then, from inside the house, a sound, the soft crackle of static. The radio in the den, an old relic that hadn't worked in over a decade, flickered to life. White noise at first, then a woman's voice, faint and distant, whispering his name. But it wasn't the name anyone called him now. Not Harold, not Mr. Weaver. The voice called him Halsey, a name he hadn't heard in 50 years. The name his mother used. The name no one knew except the cousins who drowned with him in the old creek bed one summer when they were children. Except he survived. Or at least that's what they told him. His hands began to tremble. He looked toward the radio, but the moment he stepped inside, the static died. Silence, thick and absolute. And for a fleeting second, there was a shadow seated in the old recliner. A silhouette, watching him. But when he blinked, it was gone. Only the sound of the vines scratching the walls remained like long nails searching for a crack. On the north edge of town, 8-year-old Ellie Morrison was sleeping peacefully in his room, a small blue bear curled tightly in his arms. His nightlight buzzed softly, casting warm golden shadows across the floor. But in the spaces between the light, darkness began to breathe. His dreams turned black, not dark, not empty, but pure, unnatural black, like staring into something that was never meant to be seen. Then, in the center of that blackness, a light appeared. A lantern suspended in midair, swinging from a noose tied to nothing. Around it stood 3 tall, faceless men, each one wearing robes stitched with spirals and eyes. Their mouths moved, but not in words. They chanted backwards, the sounds slithering into his ears like cold water rushing into a sealed tomb. The lantern's flame burned green. When Eli woke up, he wasn't in his bed, he was outside, barefoot, standing on damp grass behind the house. His pajamas were soaked at the hem, and his stuffed bear was missing. In front of him were 3 shallow holes in the earth, fresh, wet. A spade lay beside them, freshly used. His hands were dirty, his fingers scraped and bleeding as if he had dug the holes himself. His mother found him standing there, staring blankly into the night. He didn't speak. He just pointed at the ground and whispered. They told me where to dig. The following morning, no one in town could recall a thunderstorm the night before, but trees were snapped in half and a strange black residue had pooled in the gutters of Main Street. No one could explain the sudden electrical surges, the cracks in pavement that hadn't been there the day before, or the smell of sulfur rising from the old cemetery. But something had awakened. Not something new, but something old, something sealed. Not summoned, but remembered, because not every haunting begins with a ghost. Some begin with a memory, and memory, once called, does not forget. You only notice the darkness when the light refuses to come back. Night fell again, but this time it stayed. Angela's house went dark just after 800 p.m., even before the last fingers of daylight vanished behind the tree line. Not a power outage, no down lines, no storm, just a flicker of every bulb and then nothing. She tried the switch, then the others. The breaker, nothing worked, yet her phone still charged. The fridge hummed. The TV turned on, but only to static. She lit a candle. One flame, small, trembling, but the shadows it cast were wrong. They weren't her shadows. They moved against her, not with her. On the living room wall, a silhouette remained even after she stood up. It lingered, slightly hunched, hands long and open, as if waiting to embrace her. She tried not to look at it. She stared at her hands instead. But something was beneath her fingernails, dark dirt, fresh and wet. She hadn't left the house since work the night before. Then, in her peripheral vision, the shape in the hallway moved. Not away, but closer. Only when she looked directly at it did it vanish. But the sound remained a breath, shallow, slow, a sound that didn't belong in her lungs. Across town, Harold sat in the dark with a candle of his own. He didn't remember lighting it, didn't even own candles. But there it was, placed neatly in the center of the dining table, flickering with a steady rhythm like a heartbeat. The old photos on the walls had changed, not all of them, just the ones with his wife. In each, her face had warped, not removed, not scratched, but twisted, her mouth pulled too wide, her eyes off center, her skin faded at the edges like she was being erased. One photo showed her in the garden, planting lilies, but her hands were longer. Too many knuckles. Another showed her in the kitchen, looking back at the camera, but the background had changed. It wasn't their kitchen. It was a room Harold had never seen. Old stone, no windows, candles everywhere, symbols on the floor in rust red paint. The wind outside had died completely. The trees stood still as if holding their breath. Then the phone rang. It wasn't a ringtone, just a single tone, stretched too long, vibrating the wood under the table. He picked up the receiver. The line crackled. Then a voice whispered, "You left us there." The line cut. Eli's house remained quiet at first. Then the lights began to stutter, not all at once, but one by one. The overhead light dimmed until it popped, then his desk lamp, then the hall. The silence was like velvet, thick and heavy. Eli's drawings had changed. Where once there were spirals, now there were shapes, circles of people holding hands around what looked like a pit. Each figure had no eyes, just mouths open round and howling. He sat cross-legged on the floor, humming the same 3 notes over and over. His voice was calm, emotionless. His parents found him that way and tried to lift him up. But the moment they touched his shoulders, he screamed. Not like a frightened child, but like something primal had been disturbed, like they had touched a wound buried beneath his skin that didn't belong to him. He told them he didn't want to sleep in his room anymore. "It watches from the cracks," he said. "It waits for me to dream." That night, his mother took down all his drawings, but behind them, on the wall, drawn directly onto the paint, were symbols. Spiral after spiral, eyes drawn inside open mouths, and 3 names scratched in Angela. Harold. When she tried to scrub them, the symbols reappeared. Not just on the wall, but on the mirror, in condensation, on the window, on the skin of her palm after she wiped her son's tears. Something had begun binding them. And then the shadows came, not the absence of light, something deeper. A presence that consumed space, not just vision. In Angela's home, the covered mirrors began to twitch beneath the sheets. Faint, muffled tapping came from behind the fabric, like fingernails softly knocking from the inside. The hum returned lower this time, resonating through the bones in the walls. She tried to leave. The front door wouldn't open. It wasn't locked. It simply didn't respond. The handle turned, the deadbolt clicked, but the door stayed shut like the house itself had sealed. She ran to the window. On the other side of the glass, a face stared back. Not hers. It was her, but older, mouth sewn shut, eyes black and gleaming. The face mouthed words she couldn't hear. In Harold's home, the floorboards in the hallway began to bend upward, forming unnatural arches. Like ribs, he tried to leave through the back porch, but found his wife's old shoes blocking the door. The air smelled like wet earth and something older, like rust and burnt paper. The radio came on again. This time the voice didn't whisper his name. It chanted a phrase over and over, backward. But each syllable scratched the inside of his mind like claws across slate. And somehow he understood it, a command, a sentence. Return what was buried at Eli's home. The windows no longer showed the outside. When his parents looked out, they didn't see the backyard or the street. They saw the tree. The same tree from his drawings, the one with the ropes. It stood in a field of ash, surrounded by pits, open, dark, waiting. And at the base of the tree, 3 figures, faceless, holding something between them, a mirror. In it, they saw themselves watching. The lights in all 3 homes pulsed once, violently bright, then died. And this time, they didn't come back. Outside, the town remained untouched. Families barbecued. Teens gathered near the lake. No one knew what had begun. No one heard the hum that slithered between the homes like a soundless siren. No one saw the symbols beginning to appear beneath the town, etched into the dirt, burned into brick, hidden beneath manhole covers and behind peeling wallpaper. But those 3 homes had changed. Their air was heavier. Time inside them moved slower. Their foundations began to breathe. And beneath the silence of that summer night, the forgotten began to awaken, not with a scream, but with a whisper. Not every memory you hold is your own. Memories are not always gifts from the past. Sometimes they are wounds. Sometimes they are traps buried alive in the mind, waiting for the right moment to uncoil. And on the 3rd night of summer in Elridge, 3 minds began to fracture, not because of what they had seen, but because of what they began to remember. Memories they had never lived. Angela hadn't slept in nearly 36 hours. Her skin itched. Her eyes twitched. Her bones felt like they had been turned the wrong way around. Each time she closed her eyes, something else looked out from behind her eyelids. The dreams were no longer dreams. They were entries. diary pages from someone else's soul. In these flashes of unchosen memory, she was no longer herself. She became a woman with stitched lips, crawling through a tunnel made of bone. The walls pulsed. Her hands were raw. Someone above her whispered incantations, not in English, not in any language born of man, but she understood them. Each word carved itself into her mind like branding iron. The tunnel narrowed, and the only way forward was to dig with her face. Her mouth filled with teeth, not her own. Behind her, chains dragged. The sound was soft but constant. When she awoke, her face was bruised, her sheets were torn, her hands were blistered, and beneath her fingernails, more of that damp black soil. Down the street, Harold began to prepare things he didn't remember owning. 3 candles, a stone bowl, a knife with a handle made of braided hair. He moved slowly, deliberately, his body obeying instructions that hadn't been given aloud, as if he were following a ritual learned long ago, etched into muscle memory. He bit the tip of his tongue and let blood fill his mouth. The taste was wrong, bitter, like ash and mold. He spat it into the bowl, then added a shred of old paper he found behind the frame of his wedding portrait. It bore a symbol, 3 concentric spirals intersecting at a single point. The moment the paper touched the blood, the room went cold. Then came the chant. It bubbled up from his throat uninvited, words that burned the back of his teeth, a prayer not meant to heal but to unseal. He wept, not from pain but from fear, because the words felt like his, like something he had once promised under oath and fire. The candle flames flared green, and in the corner of the room something watched, not a shadow, not a ghost, a shape that waited. It stood between the cracks of light and dark, eyes like hollow wells, skin rippling like fabric underwater, and it listened. Every word Harold uttered, it absorbed, like it was being fed. At the Morrison home, a line no longer answered when called. He responded to something else, something that didn't speak aloud, something that called to him in vibrations beneath the floorboards and patterns in the static. He spent hours drawing, spirals, pits, eyes within eyes. But the central image kept repeating a tree, dead but alive, its bark carved with names that no living person remembered, and hanging from its branches, ropes, each bearing the weight of something unseen. Beneath the tree, 3 coffins, open, black, empty, waiting. Eli said he remembered them, not the drawings, the people inside the coffins. He told his mother he had once lived, before the tree was burned, that he had helped bury the red book and the hollow mirror. He said Dalmaru was angry, that it had waited too long, that the blood was dry and the debt was due. He didn't blink as he spoke, and when he finished, he went still for 6 hours. No sleep, no movement. Just that hum, barely audible, slipping from his lips in 3 notes. Over and over, the town remained unaware, but the land remembered. At the edge of town, the grass around the old church began to die in a perfect circle. Birds refused to land, bees disappeared, and the ground beneath the cemetery felt soft, as if something beneath had begun to stir. Angela found herself drawn to a place she didn't recognize, though her feet knew every step. An overgrown trail behind the high school led into a collapsed barn long forgotten. Inside, beneath a rusted trapdoor, she found it. A chamber, stone-lined, candle scorched, symbols on every wall, some painted, some carved, some etched into bones that had been nailed to the ceiling like talismans. She stepped inside, and the moment she did, her ears rang, voices, children, laughing, then screaming, then chanting. A mirror stood in the center of the room, cracked, ancient, its frame bound with rope. She looked into it and saw herself, dressed in robes. Her face pale, her eyes hollow, her hands holding the braided handle knife. Around her, others stood, robes, masks, and before them, 3 children, bound, marked. She screamed, but no sound came. The image remained burned in her vision for hours after she fled. Harold that night uncovered a wooden box in his attic, buried beneath layers of dust and insulation. It bore no keyhole, just a latch tied shut with 3 lengths of twine. He untied it. Inside was a letter, written in ink faded with time, signed by his grandfather. If you are reading this, it means the pact is unraveling. We buried him in the old tongue, we fed him with blood and bound him with memory. But memory decays. Do not forget the rule: 3 bloodlines, 3 seals, 3 deaths. If they remember him, he will return. Burn the mirror, drown the knife, and whatever you do, do not let the child speak his name aloud. He burned the letter, but the words did not leave. They carved themselves into his dreams, over and over. 3 bloodlines, 3 seals, 3 deaths. Eli began muttering in his sleep, not words, names, and then one night he spoke it out loud. Dal Maru. The house shook. The lights shattered, and far away, in the barn-sealed chamber, the cracked mirror wept black tears. Some graves sing not to mourn, but to summon. The 4th night didn't begin with silence. It began with music, not human music, not strings or wind or drums, but something older, something that didn't use instruments but used bones. A sound like flutes made from marrow, played through wet mouths too large to be called mouths. The melody was slow. Each note hung in the air like fog. It didn't come from outside, it came from the walls. In Angela's house, the floorboards began to breathe, up and down like lungs. A low hum pulsed with the rhythm of something vast, slumbering directly beneath the foundation. The mirror in her bedroom, long covered with a black cloth, began to bulge outward, like someone inside was pressing against it from within. She screamed when she saw her own reflection smile from beneath the veil. The bedsheets curled in on themselves, folding into a perfect spiral on the mattress. The windows fogged from the outside. Writing appeared on the condensation, drawn by invisible hands. We remember what you forgot. Angela didn't run. She fell. Her limbs twisted, seized by something unseen. Her spine arched as if strings had been pulled. She felt her skin separating, like something trying to unzip her from within. No blood, just heat, just that pressure, that presence. Her mouth filled with soil. Her last thought wasn't fear. It was recognition. She knew the hymn now. Down the street, smoke rose from Harold's chimney, even though there hadn't been a fire in years. Neighbors saw it but didn't speak. Their dogs growled, then ran. Harold stood in the center of his living room, the stone bowl at his feet. Around him were 12 candles, 9 melted flat, 3 burning with tongues of green flame. His hands moved with purpose. The blade had returned, not where he left it, not where he hid it. It was simply there, in his palm, still warm, still wet. He didn't cry this time. The ritual didn't feel foreign anymore. It felt like memory. He spoke the words and the walls vibrated. The ceiling cracked, plaster fell, and then the floor split open, not wide but deep. A narrow fissure, breathing hot air and voices from somewhere far below. He looked into it, and something looked back. He whispered one word, forgive, and the floor swallowed him whole. At the Morrison home, Eli's room was empty. His bed was untouched. The sheets cold as drawings covered the walls entirely now, layer after layer, tree, rope, coffins, spirals. The same face drawn hundreds of times, no eyes, no mouth, but a jagged black line splitting it in half like a cracked mirror. His parents searched the house in a panic, then the backyard, then the woods. They found him at dawn. He stood barefoot at the foot of a tree none of them had ever seen before. A tree that hadn't existed the day before. It rose from the earth like it had been there for centuries, its bark black, slick, and veined with something that pulsed. Ropes hung from every branch. The ground beneath was scorched, forming a wide circle of ash and burnt grass. In the center were 3 open coffins, and Eli stood between them, staring into the sky. He was humming, not a tune, a tone, a frequency low, bones shaking. When his parents called his name, he didn't turn. When they touched his shoulder, he finally spoke, quiet, clear, We are now the three. They didn't understand. But the ground did. From beneath the tree, roots began to shift, coiling upward, wrapping around the empty coffins, dragging something unseen into the open air. Not corpses, not bodies, but remnants, shreds of cloth, bone fragments, hair, teeth. The past was being unearthed, not by the living, but by the memory itself. The ritual had not summoned something new. It had reawakened something buried under silence and shame. A covenant sealed in secret by three families who thought they could hide guilt in the soil. Angela, Harold, Eli, their bloodlines were the last links in the chain, and now the chain had been pulled. The church bells rang at noon, even though no one touched them. The sound was not celebratory, it was hollow, heavy. A tolling meant not for time, but for return. Something had crossed over. That night, a fog rolled in, black, low, silent. It didn't smell like smoke. It smelled like old breath and wet stone. Like crypts opened too early. The three homes were found empty the next morning. Angela's bed was soaked in a dark oil, and her skin, intact and whole, lay folded neatly at the foot of the mattress. No organs, no blood. No trace of a body, just the skin, as if something had worn her and then stepped out. Harold's house had collapsed into itself. A sinkhole in the living room led nowhere. No depth could be measured, just endless black. The air above it hummed, and on the ceiling, drawn in suit, the same phrase repeated, "The third seal is broken." Eli was found again, but this time he wasn't alone. He was seated at the base of the tree with two figures, Angela and Harold, but younger, timeless. Their faces pale, mouths stitched shut, eyes leaking black tears that vanished before they touched their skin. They didn't blink, they didn't breathe, they were no longer themselves. And neither was Eli. All three turned their heads in perfect unison when the search team arrived. The moment flashlights hit them, they vanished, not in smoke, not in speed, just gone. The tree remained, so did the coffins, but now all three were closed. The town sealed the property, built fences, posted warnings. But some nights, especially in the thick heat of August, a chant returns. Not through the wind, but through the bones of the land itself. A sound like weeping beneath the soil, a hum that calls to the forgotten. People whisper of spiral marks appearing on bedroom walls, of mirrors warping when no one's looking, of children drawing trees they've never seen and humming songs they've never learned. Some say if you dream of the name Dal Maru, you're already part of it, because the memory doesn't die. It simply waits to be remembered.